Remember, at the time of Greece, a country like Greece would have to pay 20-30% interest rates. So basically, you cannot go to the markets anymore. And so by setting up this system, we have a very modern institution that is unparalleled in the world.
Today, I have the pleasure to visit the ESM studio to interview Pierre Gramegna. Thank you for taking the time.
It's nice to meet you again, Jérôme. It's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure too. So we all know the ESM. It's in Kirchberg, and the name is very familiar. It's a European stability mechanism, and we also read the news. And I believe stability has become a very important topic. So maybe can you present the ESM in a few words?
Yes, besides the fact that the ESM is headquartered in Luxembourg, which many residents don't know, Kirchberg everybody knows, obviously, but when you say behind Auchan, then everybody knows where it is. So, so to avoid questions, how is it in Brussels, which is a question I often get. By the way, I go to Brussels regularly and at least once a month because there's Eurogroup and ECOFIN every month. So I go to Brussels, but the headquarters is here in Luxembourg. And it's due to the fact that when the great financial crisis struck back in 2009, a temporary structure was set up called EFSF, who is the forerunner of the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM. And that was headquartered in Luxembourg because the Luxembourg, I would say, framework, legal framework, efficiency of the financial center and AAA rating of the country appeared to be the right symbol for an institution like this one. So the ESM was set up after the fact that the euro was already running since many years, because the establishment of the euro was back in 1999, the coins and the bills came in 2002, but the financial crisis happened later, and that's when the Eurogroup at the time, ECOFIN, realized that we were missing an important part in the monetary union of Europe, so the architecture was not complete. We didn't have a lender of last resort, or you could say a rescue fund for the euro area. The risk then was that a few countries might be in such trouble that they would have to leave the euro area. And what remains famous is the sentence of Mario Draghi when he said, we're going to support the euro whatever it takes. That was one arrow of the answer. The Central Bank of Europe would do whatever it takes. And the other one was to set up European Stability Mechanism. So we have 20 member states, which are also 20 shareholders. And it is the countries that have the euro. So let's knock on wood. If everything goes fine, Bulgaria will join next year the euro area, and then will become also a member if it ratifies the treaty. But that's the tradition. When you become a euro area member, then they will become the 21st member also of the euro area. And I can tell you, the newcomers, I experienced that with Croatia, they're very keen to be part of the ESM because it stabilizes their own country.
Absolutely. So how do you get the money in the fund?
Yes, in fact, the ESM functions in a different way than all the other lenders of last resort. The most important one is the International Monetary Fund, based in Washington, which has accumulated capital paid in by the countries, basically all the countries of the world. And with that capital, they can punctually help different countries, assist them with macroeconomic programs, and that's at world level. Then there are regional funds, and the one in Europe is the European Stability Mechanism, but that functions differently. The 20 countries have committed to a capital, subscribed capital of over 700 billion euro. This is whatever it takes. And the paid-in capital is 81 billion euro. With these 81 billion euros, which the ESM manages on an everyday basis, we reassure the markets, and the markets have guaranteed the ESM that we can lend up to 500 billion euro on the markets at AAA rating. So the support we give to the countries is they get the loans at a cheaper rate than if they would go themselves to the markets. Cannot go to the markets anymore. And so by setting up this system, we have a very modern institution that is unparalleled in the world.
It's like a pool, basically. You're pooling
Yes.
your interest to get a better rate.
Better rate, yes.
So I was reading today some news where we know that in Europe right now it's popular to hope that the frozen assets of Russia, the 230 billion, might be used. And of course, for a reader like me, it's a bit scary because it already sounds like last resort. So from your position, which kind of monetary instability could you anticipate?
Well, what triggered the creation of the European Stability Mechanism was the great financial crisis, which had financial repercussions on the European continent and on the European Union and the euro area.
So the subprime crisis.
The subprime crisis, yes. Now, in COVID times, which was totally unexpected, and we hadn't had a pandemic for ages, we suddenly saw that one of the measures could be to do the lockdown of all economies, which had to be decided. And obviously that can also trigger financial instability. So it's not only financial elements themselves that can trigger financial crisis. And today, so as we speak, we have geopolitical fragmentation in Europe. We have a war, an aggressive war of Russia in Ukraine, so at the doorstep of the European Union and on our continent. So that creates lots of instability, but also financial instability risks.
And we see that the stock markets yesterday were, of course, correcting a bit. We see also that there's a lot of plans for big investment. We'll talk a bit later about the Letta report, about the Draghi report. So from your position, which strategies could you implement? Is it to put more in the pool to get potential bigger access to money later?
So I think it is important to realize that the ESM, European Stability Mechanism, which is the English acronym, and by the way, in French is le MES, M-E-S, it's a different, Mécanisme Européen de Stabilité, functions a bit like an insurance. I'm going to explain why. Because the ESM is precious in times of stability and in times of financial instability. When you have an insurance against fire and your house burns down, you're pleased to have an insurance because you will have the damage reimbursed by your insurance company. But then if you have a home and for 3 or 4 years your home doesn't burn, are you throwing away your insurance policy? No.
Of course.
You're happy it doesn't burn, but you're happy that you have something that protects you. So in the end, in peacetime, in financial peace times, having the euro gives you tranquility. And the fact that, for example, until in the last 7-8 years, we have not produced any program of assistance to euro area countries is not necessarily a bad news. It is good news. It shows that we have financial stability in Europe. Now we have tensions, as we know, geopolitically, of geopolitical nature and others. So then obviously the role of the ESM becomes more intuitive. Now also here, are we there to support countries in times of dire crisis, in times where the crisis is imminent and is already hitting, or do we also have a precautionary, preventive role? We have both. Now, we have been using the traditional instruments of programs of financial support accompanied by large reforms in countries in the past decade. So that is what the large public has seen. Support to Greece was the most important one, and to 4 other countries. But we have never used what we call precautionary credit lines, which is a preventive instrument. Now, the IMF has also such instruments. They are used less because countries tend to think that they can get over the problems they have. And they only come to the IMF when the situation becomes really critical. So it is also important to realize that we have a preventive role and we can help with lighter conditions if the crisis is milder or if you just have a pending risk.
So if I follow you properly, you have a big role of advocacy among all the members.
True.
To make them act before any problem comes so that they are ready whenever they need to activate one of the mechanisms.
Yes, and so in fact it is countries that come individually and ask for support and that could give the impression that what needs to be monitored is just the financial situation of each and every country. But it is also important to look at the situation of the 20 euro area country and basically all of the EU 27, because if there are major problems there, they will have an impact on each individual. So it is key for us also to say which are pending financial stability risks that are out there. And the most obvious one I have already mentioned is the geopolitical risk and the possibility of conflicts that can come in the aftermath. That's the obvious one today, but there are two longer-term ones that are really obvious, but we might not see them with the financial consequences they can have. So let me mention the two. One is demography, and the other one is climate change. Okay. Maybe a few words on climate change and on demography. Now, recently, also because of the change of attitude of the American administration, climate change is seen by some as not being so important anymore. Thankfully, in Europe, we are still committed to the Paris Accord, and which entails very stringent reductions of CO2. So there's environmental risks there. We have seen in the latest fires, be it in Los Angeles, be it in Valencia, what damage can be caused by climate change, because the risk obviously of fires increases. Nature unleashes all its force. It can be tsunamis, it can be all these kind of things. And so it is an environmental problem. It is an insurance problem because only a quarter of all natural disasters can be insured or are insurable. So we have a large insurance gap. Third, climate change has also an impact on the valuation of assets. You might have heard about the expression of stranded assets. If you have as an asset an oil company, and at one point in time, and that's what the Paris Accord encourages all the countries to do, we should use less and less oil. Now, your asset in oil obviously should lose value, but it might not happen immediately. It might happen step by step. But so you see, this is all encompassed in the climate risk, and it has financial consequences. Demography is even easier to understand. We have a population that gets older. That means that in Europe today, you have 3 people working, financing the retirement plans of the whole population, of one person. And in one generation from now, around 2050, in Europe, as an average, we will only have 2 people working for one retired person instead of 3.
That is a problem.
So this is a big problem. So all these 3 mega trends, in fact, are for us, for the time being, the most likely issues that could trigger financial instability, not in a minute, but in the medium term.
And that's when I listen to you that one factor that comes to mind is the extreme volatility. A few years ago, weapons were clearly not an ESG acceptable asset. Now we don't know. So things change so fast. We see electric cars, we see sales dropping massively, not just on Tesla. It's like people are going back to oil. So yes, very complicated time. Maybe one last risk you did not mention. We see a lot of right or extreme right votes at the moment, and we know the narrative is of, if we take Germany or France, why do we need to pay for the 26 other members? Do you see the fragmentation of Europe as an additional big risk?
I think this is a very fair question and a complicated one. Europe has navigated troubled or troubled waters or very storms that were quite heavy over the last couple of decades. Up to now, Europe has always come out as a stronger institution with more solidarity in each and every crisis. I mentioned the great financial crisis, the subprime crisis. What happened after that? The ECB, European Central Bank, having very, very friendly monetary policy with new instruments that had not existed in the past, the creation of the ESM. COVID, we created lots of instruments. We, in fact, as ESM, proposed a pandemic crisis instrument that could have helped countries also in dire needs. And we created an instrument called Next Generation EU with reform and a relaunch fund, the RRF, which is an act of solidarity that is unparalleled in what Europe has done up to today. So we have been, every time that Europe was facing major difficulties, we had a European reaction. Now, with the war at our doorstep, we see that for the time being, Europe has answered in a united manner. But we cannot overlook that in many countries you have extreme left and extreme right parties who are not following exactly the same reasoning and the same course of action. And that is a sign that we need to explain more. We should not take the support that Europe has decided to do for Ukraine as taken for granted and evident by all the people. So need to explain. Second, we can see that in this conflict, the United States is changing its vision of the situation. So also there, the support of the United States cannot be taken for granted. So things evolve very quickly, and we are lively democracies. Extreme left, extreme right in our countries have the right to express themselves. That's what I call liberty of expression. We have it, despite what Vice President Vance said in Munich a couple of days ago. These parties can express themselves and they can earn a lot of votes. And the free flow and the free happening of democracy is that if you do not agree with those, well, you need to find the right and convincing argument.
So let's look into the future a little bit. There's two major reports which were published now a few months ago. Let's start with the Draghi report. Bold vision, 800 billion investment required per year. It's a huge financial challenge. Do you see this being implemented? How will Europe finance all this?
Yes, I think the Draghi report and the Letta report are two major reports that have not finished in the drawer of a desk and are really on the table and in everybody's mind. I think what the Draghi report underlines is the lack of competitiveness of Europe over the last 10 years. But I would dare say this is something that we have noticed even for a longer period. It might have become more evident in the last 10 years. Basically, you could say in the last 10 years, the United States grew nearly 30% of GDP, and Europe 17%, so nearly half. This is worrying if this trend were to continue. So the Draghi report and many analysts, they ring the alarm bell here. And we have seen after the COVID crisis and after the year 2021, which was a huge rebound all over the planet because we had the lockdowns. But since 2022, Europe has a growth of around 1%, which is really a low level growth. You could call it a shallow growth. And now markets, and not only markets, the Draghi report and others start to say, are we facing here a structural issue in Europe? Or is this just a transitionary phase? And I think there's a recognition that it's probably getting more and more structural, and that's what the Draghi report is all about. So the Draghi report gives a lot of ways and means to strengthen European competitiveness. And he also attributes a price tag to it. We mentioned the number around 800 billion euro investments per year. So it is important here to underline that a large chunk of that is private investment. So we need to create an atmosphere and a framework in Europe that is conducive to investments, that encourages Europeans to invest in their economy, but also foreign enterprises to invest in Europe. And second, you could say probably between 20 and 25% a quarter must come from public money. But this is also a challenge as the budgets of many European countries are strained. We have now a new Stability and Growth Pact, to be on the optimistic side here, which puts more emphasis on investment than the past one. So we have a longer adjustment period in order to make sure that the countries abide to the rules of Stability and Growth Pact. So that's good news, but that's certainly not sufficient. So to stay with the Draghi report, the Commission has published a couple of days ago a compass of competitiveness, a kind of dashboard that will help us have a clear view where we stand today, but how our competitiveness is going to improve in the future.
And two quick comments about this. First, last week, Serge Allegrezza, I think it's the Observatory of Competitiveness, published a report. And we saw very clearly in this report that it's important for Europe, even more for Luxembourg, because we see that Europe was growing at a pace and the competitiveness of Luxembourg was dropping over the past 10 years. And another example I saw recently is the CEO of Michelin, who explained that it produces all over the world. And the only place in the world where it doesn't work is in France, where the company is headquartered. So these are the type of challenges where, of course, decisive action is required at European level. Maybe one word about the Letta report. So
if I may, to react to your comments on Luxembourg and France. The reason why competitiveness or productivity is slightly lower in Luxembourg than it used to be is because the main driver of productivity in Luxembourg is services, and in particular financial services.
Yes.
Now, financial services have suffered a lot in the COVID time and also with the ultra low interest rates. So I think that the services sector, and especially for Luxembourg, the finance sector, is in better shape now. So we will have a kind of mechanical improvement here in Luxembourg. That doesn't mean that nothing needs to be done. I think, though, that Luxembourg has recognized also in the last couple of years that even more must be done in digitalization, in AI. And I think that the country is positioning itself very well. I also think of fintech and lots of foreign players in these areas that choose Luxembourg as their hub. And if you compare Luxembourg to France, what the head of the CEO of Michelin was saying is that the non-wage part of salaries, that means contribution to health and to pensions and other social taxes that are levied on the salaries, are extremely high in France and in Belgium. And here again, that's not the case in Luxembourg. So basically in France, you need to pay more than double as an entrepreneur, and the salaryman receives half. So the social cost is detrimental to competitiveness. Because there's no easy answer to that question, especially if that's the tradition, but it underlines a problem that is pervasive in quite a few European countries. And it can only be compensated if we have a higher productivity. So you can have a very good safety net. The Scandinavians show that to us. The Danish, especially the Danish, very, very good safety net, high protection, high costs, high taxes even, very high productivity. So the two things need to go hand in hand.
Yeah, and I think all those countries in Europe, especially those who were having thriving economies, I have in mind, of course, Germany, France, Luxembourg, are facing many new challenges.
True.
Of course, Ukraine, of course, competition with China and a very aggressive competition now with the US.
Yes.
So of course, we need to figure out how to adapt to this new environment. Maybe a last word about the Letta report. So the idea is to have a capital market union. Or what do you think about this? Do you think it would be a danger for Luxembourg with a specialist of cross-border sale of funds or life insurance, or do you see this as a very positive effect for Europe?
I think the Letta report is really of a great quality. First, I like the title. The title is, well, we all call it Letta report, but Enrico Letta himself has told me, no, I've spent so much time in finding a good title for this report, and it is EU Single Market, much more than a market. And I think it's all encompassed in this formula. So what does he underline? Well, he underlines that, first of all, our EU single market is probably, with the euro and Schengen, the passport-free Europe, the greatest achievement and success story of Europe. The single market was negotiated between 1985 and 1993, so that's a generation ago. So for goods, it's probably quite efficient, but for services already far less. And for the new economy, it is not adapted. So what we need for the single market is a modernization of the EU single market to look at it with the eyes of 2025, with the challenges of the economy today and the new type of hurdles that exist, that are very sophisticated and a different nature. And also to highlight that on everything which is, or a lot that is new economy, we have hurdles amongst ourselves. We have hurdles amongst ourselves in capital markets, in financial services. Despite the fact that directives on financial services are a large amount, have flourished and have made Luxembourg strong. Because what makes Luxembourg strong, although I'm not here to speak for the benefit of Luxembourg, but for those who think that having internal borders inside the EU is to the advantage of one country or another, is a big mistake. So what makes us strong is to have a market with few hurdles, or if possible none, because then we have a home market where companies can grow and become bigger players. If you are a US company, you have the United States home market as a base. If you have that in Europe, you are at par. If you have cut it into pieces, you are at a big disadvantage, and size matters. On the Letta report, it is important to realize that if you can reduce the level of barriers, it has an impact on our growth that is spectacular. The IMF has calculated that reducing by 10% the existing barriers in Europe, you gain a growth dividend of 7%. So it's a huge number.
Yes.
And let's not forget it. At a time where in the United States, and then as a retaliation maybe in other countries, we're going to have higher tariffs. It will be entail a slowdown of growth in Europe, because we are more dependent on external markets than others. To give you figures, for Europe, exporting and import, so foreign trade of goods and services, represents 60% of our GDP. For China, 35%, and for the United States, 25%. So we are more prone to suffer from a departure from the free flow of goods and services that was where we were all striving with the globalization. And we could become more weakened than others. That's why strengthening also the single market is also for that reason more important. Last but not least, on the Letta report, he also highlights that the risk coming from geopolitics and fragmentation due to war in Ukraine and in the rest of the world, could also bring into play the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, where we are today, by saying it will be difficult for some countries to reach the 2% expenditure compared to GDP for defense purposes. And as we have heard in the last couple of weeks, now 2 is even considered too low a number. Whatever the number, or whatever, if the number is even higher, that stress on public finances will even become stronger. So the Letta report says, well, why not use the ESM to help those countries that have little room of maneuver with a precautionary credit line. Again, this is more the preventing arm instead of waiting that countries has huge problems and which would require huge adjustment programs and reforms. These precautionary lines could be dealt with objective criteria of conditionality, which means if you use those loans for defense purposes, you could access the European Stability Mechanism. So that's one specific part of the Letta report. But we're just in the beginning in all the things that pertain to defense, to write down ideas, I would say, because the challenges for Europe are multiple, not only spending enough to satisfy NATO requirements, but also additional investments that would be necessary if we want strategic autonomy of Europe in the field of defense, which I think is on everybody's mind, but will be a long path.
A challenge to be financed. Just to conclude, I have 2 ideas coming to mind. You mentioned first borders, and it's a very strong reminder when you go to Germany today that they are controlling after the border, just after Trier, which of course was unimaginable just a few years ago. And the second thing which should all give us hope is that you mentioned the common market started in 1985. I think we can agree everything started with a meeting in Schengen.
Yes.
So let's hope that Luxembourg will again be a critical catalyst, especially between France and Germany, to take those great ideas from Enrico Letta and Mr. Draghi to find solutions in a very fast changing world. Thank you very much for your time.
It was a pleasure.